If you're anything like me, you've bought into the hype around pure pigment paints, such as these or these. I personally bought this Chimera base set about 3 years ago and have been using them ever since. Wait, there it is. A big selling point for these paints is that they are much more saturated than the standard premixes that you might get from such brands as Vallejo, AKA, or Army Painter. However, the pure pigments are not all fun and games. Using this potential for super saturated painting comes with some unique challenges as well. For one, the pure pigment paints are much less consistent in their consistency and coverage than the standard premixed acrylic paints are. You'll also have to learn how to desaturate some of these very saturated colors, and you'll have to learn how to mix a variety of hues that you'd otherwise just get from a bottle. The Chimera base set that I just showed you, for instance, doesn't have a single brown in it. And though I find that most students have a really good theoretical understanding of color relationships and color theory, it's not always that this knowledge is being put into practice. And so that's what we'll do today. We'll tackle how to mix these pure pigment paints and how to create a harmonic, consistent, desaturated scheme using them. We'll see this using both oils and acrylics, and by the end of this video you'll have a much better understanding of how to use pure pigment paints. Sounds good? Let's get started. I'll be painting Thanatos from Michael Contreras Miniatures. The scheme will consist of desaturated violet shadow tones and more or less desaturated oranges and yellows, and then this saturated green accent color. So this is roughly the gamut that I'm working with. And before we get started, I want to remind you that there is a longer, much more in-depth version of this lesson available to my patrons over on Patreon. So if you're in the mood for a deep dive that is 2+ hours long and goes much more in depth with the particular techniques of each step of how I painted this miniature, you can go ahead and check that out through that Patreon link down in the description. Let's get started with the actual painting. The first step was to bring out the airbrush and do a violet undercoat and then a zenithal white ink, and then hit that white with some orange in order to establish the general ambience that I'm working with. I then took out the oil paints, did a pre-glaze of Magnamese Violet, and mixed a variety of skin tones with the oils, using Naphthol Red, Indian Yellow, that same Magnamese Violet, and a bit of Cobalt Turquoise, and of course, white. You see, when I add these colder turquoise and violet tones to the mix, they really help to desaturate the warm tones of the reds and the yellows. As you can see, the individual mixes are either cooler or warmer, and when I apply these to the model, they even each other out. Let me show you what I mean. If we have a colder color and we put a warmer color on top, we can mix these colors together and get a result that is either desaturated, or we can leave some of both visible and get a result that has this nice temperature contrast. And this concept of stacking warm and cold colors on top of each other is exactly what we'll do throughout this paint job. And you can really make color mixing this simple. Without thinking about any of the more complex relationships between different colors, just try to sit down and layer cold and warm colors on top of each other. Let's get back to the model. I really like this method of painting since it helps to create some of that natural variety that we need to have in skin tones. For this bust, the first layer of oils is going to be a little bit warmer and the second layer is going to be colder, especially in the highlights. After the first coat of skin tones is dry, I apply a second coat in order to saturate some of the midtones a little bit more. All paints are quite transparent, and putting down this second coat can really help to gain some of that saturation. go ahead and look at the slight difference in saturation between this wet and dry picture of the oils. And as you can see, I'm favoring more of these colder highlight tones in the second layer on the skin here. And so let's think a little bit about what this blue-white color does to the orange tone of the skin. The skin tone itself is a very desaturated form of orange, and the blue is the complementary color to orange. That means that these two colors have the greatest amount of contrast that you can have within the traditional understanding of color theory. So just like we saw before, that if we blend these together, we can desaturate the entire color of the surface, but if we leave some parts of each color visible, we get this nice temperature contrast. And it's exactly this relationship between blue and orange that we'll use when we move on to painting the non-metallic helmet. Here I'm going for a brass non-metallic metal look that's supposed to reflect the sky above. The only issue is that these warmer metals such as gold, brass or copper don't do too well with reflecting blue. So that blue sky, when it's reflected in a brass surface such as this one, is going to turn more towards green. But this green will still look blue in comparison to all of the other tones that are reflected onto the helmet. So you can think of these non-metallic metal colored surfaces as a colored mirror that really filters everything that it reflects. So you have to think of a marriage between the local color of the surface and the color of what is being cast onto the surface and reflected there. And the way I paint this is to put down a blue underpainting. When we then add these orange and yellow tones on top, we're going to shift that blue towards green. And just as we saw in the skin tone, we're then seeing a different color as a result of this underpainting. And this is how I like to think about desaturation. Using the complementary relationships to my advantage is much more interesting than using grays, whites, or blacks in my opinion. It looks more vibrant and really just adds a different layer of creativity. In general, I think that our understanding of mixing colors and color theory as painters is just as important as our use of the brush itself. So I always place a heavy emphasis on color choices and color mixing in my teachings. And if that's something you're interested in, I want to invite you to join me on my Patreon, and you can join this list of super cool supporters that I have right now. I'm so very grateful for their support, and I hope that you'll consider joining them. There is so much good stuff available over on my Patreon, and what you see here on YouTube is really just a fraction of the total amount of content. At the point of shooting this video, we're talking about somewhere between 20 to 30 hours of content on the Patreon. I hope to see you there, and let's get back to the painting. I also paint this green gem in the chest using a totally tried and true method, placing the brighter values of the green on both the top and the bottom of the gem since the light is shining through this material. And here we can really see the strength in that super saturated pure pigment paint. This is just a combination of phthalo green, a little bit of white and yellow. And then of course I placed the final reflection on the very top of the gem. I did some other adjustments around the piece, such as airbrushing a little bit and painting the stone parts before calling the model finished. I hope that this video has helped you in some way to use your pure pigment paints. I think that learning these skills is super important for our growth as painters, and I really love how I'm able to switch between different mediums and paints effortlessly because I know how to mix similar tones with each medium. And because the colors are pure pigment, they are super predictable in how they behave when we mix them together. So my friends, don't be scared to try out these pure pigment paints if you haven't done so yet. They're a really wonderful tool and they'll teach you a lot once you get comfortable using them. If you like this video or if it inspired you in some way, please let me know in the comments. And for now, here's Thanatos. Thank you so much for watching and happy painting.